of independent business. And they predominantly were suing over what most of you know, Obamacare, remember, was this massive, 2,000+ page bill that had all kinds of tentacles. Most people recognize the core of it being the individual mandate, the requirement that you purchase insurance or pay a penalty. The NFIB predominantly sued over that on behalf of its members. The states, their big injury that they were able to claim when they went into court was the fact that the federal government was coercing them to expand the Medicaid program in a way that it had never operated, and forcing them, if they chose not to do that, they were going to withhold the first dollar of federal funding. Well, this ends up being a big deal. If you take a look, for instance, at Ohio's budget, Medicaid, without federal tax dollars, is about 30%. 30% of Ohio's budget. You put in the federal funding, it's about, recently Greg Moody on behalf of the Kasich administration testified that it's 45% of Ohio's budget. So this is a huge chunk of funding. So the idea that the feds would pull the rug out on the first dollar would devastate the states. They really didn't have the choice. In fact, the Supreme Court, when they looked at it, essentially said that this was negotiating at the point of a gun. So the Supreme Court in this case found that it was unduly coercive to condition the first dollar of federal funding for Medicaid on accepting the big government program that is Obamacare Medicaid expansion. And they gave the states the option of whether they wanted to participate in it or not. That the first dollar couldn't be conditioned. And so that's how we got where we are. And that ends up, I think, being important to keep in mind, because you've had some folks who are talking about this say, well, I'm not for Obamacare, but this isn't really what Obamacare was about. Well, that's just false. In fact, the lawsuit that Ohio filed as a state was largely in order to have the ability not to have to participate in this. So this really is why Ohio sued, fundamentally, was not to have to expand this program in this way, in a way that would potentially really harm taxpayers in the long run. Being now in a situation in which the administration has argued as part of their budget in favor of expanding Medicaid, what are the potential issues there? One, we need to take a look at federal spending. Now, unfortunately, this is a very, I would say, sort of craftily crafted bill, which is to say, all the goodies, the way I sometimes refer to it is, this is government by drug dealer, essentially. The first hit is free. The next one's going to cost you. And so, the federal government has structured it so that for the first 3 years of the Medicaid expansion, it's free. At least in terms of the premiums. The federal government pays 100%. Then it phases down to 90%. And so even then, a lot of the states are like, that's a good deal, because right now for the general Medicaid program, the federal government pays about 63, 64% for Ohio. So this is a lot more money, to include this population. This is a good deal for us. Well, one of the questions you have to ask is this sustainable? We're looking right now at a $16.5 trillion deficit. Spending on Medicaid between 2014 and 2022, estimated federal spending alone over $3 trillion. Even the Obama administration, in terms of some of the debt talks, has talked about, okay, well, we're going to have to perhaps look seriously at entitlement reform and entitlement cuts. And yet, this is a program that is going to vastly expand government spending, federal government spending. They simply can't afford it. It's simply not sustainable. So what's going to happen? Well, even the Supreme Court, when they looked at this question, said it's very likely that the federal government at some point in the future could change the match rates, and that would end up meaning that the states would have to pick up more of the bill. It would become, essentially an unfunded mandate or liability to the states. Again, so what does that mean? Even tinkering on the edges, the Obama administration already recommended one slight tweak to the rate. It would have increased the amount that Ohio would have to pay over the next 2 years by $2 billion. And that was just a slight adjustment. That was just using what they called a blended rate. If they actually substantially reduce the amount, it would be crushing to the state budget. And this is important to keep in mind because some of the arguments that have been made for, we should expand Medicaid because, we can perhaps make some money off of it from the federal government, and it'll help us in terms of tax reductions for people right now. If the federal government were to reduce the amount that it's going to contribute, all those tax reductions are going to be eaten up with tax increases that will keep on coming, because there'll be no other way for the state to pay for this big program that they've signed us on to. So for those who think that this is going to be a good deal, that this is going to help out Ohio's economy, in the long term, it's very likely going to lead to much higher spending and much higher taxes. Another thing, if you take a look, there's been a lot of studies. I mean, if you take a look at the paper, which I think has been circulated, and if you didn't get one, there's some more in back. There's been a lot of suggestions about revenue projections. We go into why that's wrong. They don't even take into account administrative costs, which are going to be very sizable for Ohio. But I suppose, one of the questions is, if we're going to take on this sort of burden, shouldn't we be helping people? Shouldn't the program actually be helping people? And the answer is, it's not. I mean, and this is something that actually a lot of people have a hard time grappling with. First of all, let's talk about who it is that we're expanding this for. One, Medicaid traditionally covers pregnant women, families with children, individuals with disabilities, and the aged. The Medicaid expansion that they're offering would cover everyone from 0 to 138% of the federal poverty line. So who is it that they're really expanding it for? Low-income individuals who are able-bodied, and who don't have children, who aren't disabled, who aren't elderly. And one of the problems is there's no incentives in this, unlike some of the other welfare programs where we've been able to put in responsibility requirements for personal responsibility. There's no requirement that you ever look for a job or try and find a job. As long as you've got low income, even if you're able-bodied, you're entitled to this benefit in perpetuity. So we take a program that really was a safety net for individuals who we thought we had a reason as society to support, and we extend it to everyone who's able-bodied and don't give any requirement that they attempt to better themselves, to contribute to society. So fundamentally, first, I think that that's probably the wrong way for us to be looking at a program. It's going to actually encourage people not to work who otherwise might be able to work, to not seek work, not to better themselves, not to get job free. We can do better. But even if we thought it was that this wasn't a problem, the program itself is a failing program. Study after study shows that people on Medicaid actually have worse health outcomes. This is apple for apple. People say, oh, this is just going to emergency room. No, this is looking at, I have a study that looked over 900,000 separate procedures that were done, and breaks it out by transplants, by types of cancer, etc. They have worse health outcomes than people with no insurance at all. Let that soak in for a moment. In fact, we're going to be spending billions of dollars to make people worse off than they would be if they didn't have health insurance. The reason is because it's such a dysfunctional program in terms of how the funding works, the requirements on doctors. Most good doctors just won't have anything to do with it. It becomes too much of a burden over time, and so you end up having a low quality care under the program. So those of you who come up to you and make the compassionate argument, we've got to be able to help these people. Well, this isn't helping these people. This is trapping them in dependency, and it's giving them bad health outcomes. And that's not what we should be doing for our fellow Ohioans. The other thing, we talked a little bit about the federal spending issue and the state spending issue. Should we, as Ohioans, really be contributing to increasing the national debt? I mean, even if one of the arguments is, well, we should be getting ours. We as Ohio taxpayers, we're contributing this money, in our federal taxes. So we should get our taste of that money back. So we might as well, if the federal government's going to be spending it, we might as well get it. Well, I mean, I think there's a couple of arguments. One, I would say there is at least a precedent from this administration where they just said no, we're not going to be a party to that, and that was with the high-speed rail project. The governor said, in that case, we'd been offered the money to do the high-speed rail. If we didn't take the money, it was going to go someplace else, and in fact it did. It went to California. But the governor said, no, we're not taking the federal money in that case. And that's the right precedent here. But the difference between there and here is there, once again, it was a fixed pool of federal spending. If we didn't take that money, it was still going to be spent someplace else. It was going to be the same amount of federal spending. But with regard to Medicaid expansion, it's not. You see, if Ohio doesn't sign on, then all the burden of the federal dollars for Ohio, that doesn't get spent. And if other states follow suit, then the federal program doesn't grow. You see, it's not that they've allocated a certain amount of money, they're just going to spend however much based upon the number of people who sign up. So in this particular case, by signing up, we're increasing the federal burden for everyone. We're increasing the federal debt. So the idea that we should just, get ours out of this ends up being an argument for we should make the federal government bigger. We should make the federal program bigger. We should be spending more money. And at the end of the day, quite frankly, when the federal government isn't able to pay its bills, Ohio's going to be stuck with those bills. In response to some of these questions, one argument I hear frequently is, well, what we should do is just we'll take the early easy money, and then we'll get out. The federal government's paying 100% up front. We'll take that, and then if the federal government ever does what you're saying, or I should say what I'm saying, we'll go ahead at that point and we'll put a circuit breaker in. We'll put a sunset provision. We'll back out of the program. When in the history of the world has a government entitlement program shrunk substantially? When have we knocked 500,000 people off of a welfare program overnight? Because that's what they'd be talking about doing. I don't see that happening practically. And even if but that assumes it's an option. The interesting thing is most of the folks who have said this have never read the Supreme Court's opinion in the Obamacare case. The Supreme Court ended up giving the states a lifeline. They said, you can't be compelled with the first dollar to enter the program because you couldn't, and one of the key points of logic is you couldn't have foreseen Obamacare back in the 1960s, or back when you previously were signing on to elements of the program. So there's no way we can hold you to that. This is such a fundamental transition to the program. We talked about how it is, you're just changing it from a program for this limited class of people to everyone below a certain income level. That changes what the program is. You couldn't have foreseen that that's going to be a big impact on your state. Well, in fact, now if you sign on, you can foresee that it's possible that the federal government, in fact, the Supreme Court said that they could change your match rates later on. You could end up owing a lot more. And so next time, if you go ahead and back out and say, oh, no, you can't withhold first dollar of funding, I think it's very likely the Supreme Court will say, we told you at the time that they can change the rate. You could foresee that. The statute says that the Secretary can withhold first dollar of funding. What did you think was going to happen? So, in fact, as a matter of law, it's very unclear. In fact, the law looks much stronger for the fact that the federal governments could simply demand that you go ahead and either adhere to the program or give up first dollar of funding. Which basically means, at this point, if you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound. If you're in for 90% match rate, then you're in for if they drop it down to the current rate of 64. And I think this is a good argument when you're talking to those, to your friends and neighbors who maybe don't agree with you on everything. They think that the state government should be spending more on this or that. Well, quite frankly, if that happens, the state, this is going to eat up any money that the state could spend on just about anything else. So if they have other budget priorities, if they think the state should be spending more on education or on roads or what have you, it's not going to happen. We're going to have to use it in order to just pay for the Medicaid program, which we're stuck in and can't get out of. You know, with that, I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A, and I'm happy to chat about other issues that you guys working on as well, or other issues in the budget process. But I guess I would say I would leave you off with a few words that the Supreme Court said when they gave the states these choice, which is that the states are separate and independent sovereigns. Sometimes they need to act like it. With that, I'll take any questions you have. Yes, sir.
Yeah, a couple of questions. Why do we sue in the first place? If we're going to opt into this, then why do we sue to stay out of it? Why do we spend the time and money in the budget for it to be some part of the cost? If in the end, we're just going to say, well, we're going to take it anyway.
It's a good question. I mean, I suppose that there are those who would say that it's one thing. This way, they at least have the option to make the choice instead of being completely compelled. But it is a little bit. I agree with you. It is a little bit quizzical as to why it is that we would fight so hard. We would, in court all the way up to the Supreme Court, so that we don't have to expand the program. Only then to say, well, we didn't want to be compelled to, but we'll voluntarily sign on. It's interesting because some of the arguments that were made in court were well, it's such a good deal that there's just no way that any state would ever want to say no. That's it's really not compulsion. And walking through it, the court said, it's actually not that great a deal. There's an awful lot of strings attached. There's an awful lot of risk for the states. There's any number, a lot of things that we've talked about here. There's any number of reasons why a state would say, no, this isn't a good deal for me. Now, there's some states that, for instance, it is a good deal for them. They didn't sign on to the litigation. They in fact end up being net winners on this. If you take a look at New York State, for instance, oddly enough, they're going to have a windfall from this because of the way they structure their program now. And so with states like that, you can understand why they signed on right away, and they don't really seem to have any problem with big government spending anyway. So.
Here's a question I have. What is the system of healthcare? We've had a company in the state of Ohio that they couldn't do Obamacare.
Mm-hmm.
And now they're doing Obamacare. Where does this sit with, and I realize the government really don't care about the law, but where does this sit with that law?
Well,
I'm sorry, our extra mic isn't working, so if you can repeat the question,
I'll
that would be
repeat the
really
question.
helpful. Thank you.
So I'm sorry, what was your name?
Chuck.
So Chuck asked the question, how does this fit in with the healthcare amendment? Because we voted against Obamacare on the healthcare amendment. And now, they seem to be going ahead and, enacting part of Obamacare in state law anyway. And the answer is, the healthcare amendment does not directly control in this case because that dealt with the issue of mandates. It didn't say that none of Obamacare can be implemented. It dealt specifically with the individual mandate provisions. And so it doesn't directly control, but it should be a strong signal, and it's something that, if you're talking to, again, I can't lobby, but if you're talking to your legislators, it's an interesting thing to remind them, which is just how strongly Ohioans were opposed to Obamacare in terms of this. It may not control as a matter of law, but it should go to something of how Ohioans feel about Obamacare.
How determined in this case in the House and the Senate is that? What's going on there?
Well, the Kasich administration has made it a part of his budget, so this is something that he's vigorously promoting. He's attempting to work to get some flexibility on the implementation from Valerie Jarrett in the White House.
Oh, yeah, she'll take care of it.
And from the and from the Obama administration Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services. The problem with that, other than the laughter at dealing with Valerie Jarrett, is my understanding, at least, is that any flexibility they could get would be in one of two flavors. One, it would still involve opting into the expansion. You might change how it is that the insurance operates. You might be able to shift individuals to the exchanges rather than having them on pure Medicaid. And there's reasons that that might actually be better in some ways, but worse in others. If you shift over to the exchanges rather than regular Medicaid, the cost, according to the CBO, increases by 50%. So all the things that we talked about in terms of the numbers, you're basically just slamming your foot on the accelerator. And you're going to be increasing federal spending, and you're going to be increasing state spending much faster. So that's one potential problem with it. The second thing is any of the other flexibility, they would get through a waiver. Well, under federal law, waivers only last for 3 years. And at which point the state gets to come back to whoever the secretary is at that point and say, Mother, may I continue to run the program the way I'd like to run the program? And at any point they can say no. And if Ohio then thinks it can back out, they can say, okay, then we're withdrawing first dollar funding, which means that at that point over 30% of your budget is going to, explode on you. So we're right back into that sort of trap. So the Kasich administration, again, is pushing that. The House is currently considering the question as part of their budget process. The Senate hasn't even started taking it up yet.
Can you push back from the House and Senate?
Oh yeah, no, I think that there's a number of folks in there who have very serious concerns about it. I've chatted with a large number of folks on the Capitol Square, and they've got concerns. But